Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to Drawing Down the Stars and the Occult Explorers. I'm Snappy, and I'm joined, as always, by my dear friend and co-host, Dion. How's it going, Dion?
Reporting for duty.
Life is beautiful.
That's right. That's right. We're breathing. As long as we're breathing, life is beautiful.
Right? As long as we're breathing and we're here, right? It's worth kicking it. And we're back for part 3 of our deep dive into the occult world of espionage and the great game. And this is going to be a real fun one. But before we begin, we want to give you guys all a warning. We're going to be getting into modern politics, and modern politics always brings, issues. So bear in mind that this is all our speculation, and we're just a couple of schlubs on the internet having fun. And there's nothing here to worry about. We're just talking, sharing ideas, and looking at connections. You got anything to say, Dion?
Oh yeah, trigger warning, huh? Um, we deconstruct our heroes at that.
Right.
That's just part of the game, the mystery, the fun of it.
Absolutely, absolutely. We deconstruct everything. We want to look behind the veil and the curtain. Like today, we're continuing that deconstruction. You're going to be giving us a wild exploration of a bunch of different things. What's the overall theme for your presentation, Dion?
Well, it's this theme for the past couple episodes is that the occult and politics on the world stage have always gone hand in hand. And when we look back at World War One and World War Three, World War Two, yeah, soon, huh? No,
Maybe.
just going back to the monarchy and the kings and queens of England and Spain and France and all this mischief and revolutions, that there's secret societies involved in all this. And a lot of our uh, famous poets and actors and painters are involved in this. Um, Everyone, it interconnects, let's just say, in a great game.
Absolutely. In a great game. And this is so funny and so interesting because things that we often take for granted wind up having such an incredible impact and play such a large role. For example, artists and musicians, poets, and theatrical performers, right? These were all people who were involved in every aspect. Like, none of this is devoid from culture. It's a manifestation of culture. And of course, they're going to participate in the cultural wars, right? It goes hand in hand. And one of the things that I want people to understand too about magicians, especially, is that the essential essence of the magician is this projection of will and telling of a story, right? In all of these myths, one thing you should notice through all of these episodes of Occult Explorers is that they're all political. They're all vilifying the other and asserting their own power, trying to manifest and shape the future, right? None of those apocalypses are really about the apocalypse. They're about shaping the future, This is what's really going on. And all of these kings, all of these countries, all of these nations, they play with myth and idealism. They play with images. They play with art and poetry, all to express and expand their ideas, all to compete and to win in these wars, right?
This is true. We started with John Dee, was part of
Yep.
it as an archetype. Not say we're not saying a kingmaker, but people that are behind the kings and queens, dealing with magic and astrology, occult, divination. Um,
It's
and
just wild to me, like we saw with like John Dee, right? This is someone who was actively invoking magic to manifest empire and was going out specifically with the purpose of crafting myth to influence his fellow nobles, to influence British explorers. And then we see the impact. They take up the language that he used. They use many of his ideas, this idea of we're the embodiment of that Christian purity and we're going to go transform the world and we have the right. We have the right to conquer the savage and all this stuff. A lot of that is born, at least in the English experience, with John Dee. And he actively went around promoting this through myth. We saw that through that pamphlet he wrote on British Empire. And we saw that on his geological text. Trying to remember. Anyway, we did a whole deep dive on it. He wrote a bunch of books on this, and he was involved in it in many different ways. Really interesting stuff. And you're right, he was also the prototypical spy. We saw that his sigil, the eyes, right? And he was the eyes of Queen Elizabeth. He was her astrologer, right? And those eyes then later on became the 007, right?
And there's also an element of Christian mysticism or Christian alchemy, let's say. There's a sub-theme there. So in speaking of D, we're going to start with D today too a little bit.
Oh, that's interesting. We should
just... His son, actually.
Oh, wild. Yeah, because I did read a little bit. His son, so I remember D was offered a position in Russia and he turned it down. And he spent the last years of his life kind of, living in his wealth and relative obscurity till he died of old age. Whereas his son took up that position and went to Russia and became the magical astrological advisor to the Russian court, which is wild because this is direct opposition. Like, this all takes us. So what gets crazy is we also talked about in our previous episode, after John Dee, we talked about Crowley. And Crowley was deeply connected to that John Dee image. He saw himself as the reincarnation of Edward Kelly. We showed how in his early childhood, Crowley he swore oaths to Queen and Empire as a cadet. He was involved in the Primrose Society, which was this deeply Tory, conservative British movement that was about, promoting the crown. And we saw how Crowley was involved in the fall of the Golden Dawn as a potential spy operation to undermine an extremist Jacobite political movement. And there's so much wildness going on here. But what I'm going to be exploring today in my presentation is Gurdjieff. I've really been interested in these ideas of these masters and how they're all related to spycraft. And Gurdjieff is no different. Another master who's deeply involved in the spycraft and also is obscured. Just like Crowley and John Dee, this stuff is hidden. So it's not 100% clear how he was involved, but he certainly is. And what's wild with Gurdjieff is it's on both sides. He seems to be fighting at one point for the Tsarists and then later on for the communists. And it's hard to say where his allegiances ever lie outside of his own magical workings, but really interesting characters on all of these kinds of people are involved in this magical work and involved in that spycraft. And it, like with Crowley, it began literally in childhood. And he talks about this. He says, this was the defining oath that guided my entire life. Even though, I may have been a radical rebel, at heart, I still swore allegiance to Queen and country. He still came back and fought for them no matter what. And I think he was almost certainly a spy.
Yep. Well, let's hit that first pick and let's get started today.
All right, let's get into your presentation. So where are we beginning? Oh, 1 second here. Where are we beginning, Dion?
1616. Russia. This is called a bridal show. It's the famous bridal show, 1616, because I want to set the stage of how Arthur D came to Russia. Right here, this is a painting of Tsar Michael. And he's the first Romanov ruler, mind you, because the Romanovs are going to play a big part of this. We talked about that in the last episode with Rasputin and the Romanovs in Russia there. And this is in 1616. He's made ruler of the throne there. They got to get him a wife. So they have something that's called a bridal show with 500 women.
Oh, wow.
Yes, that come from the villages. And he ends up meeting one, the prettiest one, probably the one that, winked at him the right way, and boom, Maria. They hook up, get married, and within a few months, he deports her to the Siberia.
Oh, gosh.
Because she was
terrible.
She couldn't make babies, or the heir that he wanted. You know, that's part of it. Having an heir to take over the dynasty, these imperial dynasties. And so at this time, they invite John Dee. Hey, come over, come over and help guide, because you did a good job there in England. We see what you can do.
Junior. Yeah, oh, yeah, John Dee Senior at this time.
Oh,
right?
he turned it down. He turned it down, but his son, he told his son, well, hey, we have an opportunity here. Yes, go over to Russia, and using our trickerations and our astrologies and our charts and our magical symbols, let's do this. Let's build another empire over there. You know, go to the next image. And you know, the thing, he was a court physician there for a number of years. You know, if we go to like 100 years later, because I want to set the stage for, we talked about Catherine the Great, you know, building mythologies for Russia, these empire making myths. It goes back earlier to Arthur D. And being imported from England, whose father had created and helped craft an empire. And so 100 years later, we were talking before about Katerina, Tsarita Katerina, Catherine the Great. Her real name is Princess Sophia of Prussia. German born.
She's German.
Yeah. But so these myths that were created around her, you know, and part of how this relates to the whole story, why I'm bringing her back is, all right, they're called the Burrat Buddhists and Lamas, from, you know, the word Lama, like Dalai Lama. And they worshipped Catherine the Great as the reincarnation of the White Terra.
That's,
you know, I have an image there, right there, and that's a statue of there in Russia. And there's a whole contingent of Buddhists that believe she was the reincarnation. And at that the Romanov dynasty was the reincarnation of the white, going back to the White Terra, as well as how do you say it, a dynastic lineage, Buddhic lineage at that. And there's this myths that were integrated in this Russian mysticism.
It connects to the what is her name, or what is the name? The Bodhisattva of Compassion, Avalokiteshvara, as well, right? This is all kind of wild stuff. And this is, again, part and parcel of the myth making. One of the things that's truly magical about Russia is that they combined East and West, right? They have both of these working in conjunction. On one hand, they are the rebirth, they are the third Rome, right? They are this new Christian empire, but with that ancient Greco-Roman legacy. And on the other side, they are this continuation of the Golden Horde, right? With this Buddhist sovereignty. It's powerful stuff.
And here, I also want to show that connection between Tibetan Lamas and the Tsar's court in Russia, because it sets the stage later for when we get into Gurdjieff. That myth building and that connection between these courts. But it wasn't just them, it was Britain. It was a lot of different people were trying to get into Tibet. Britain eventually invades Tibet in 1904. But all right, so let's keep pushing forward with this, where I want to show you. All right, so here we got right here. This is George V and Nicholas II. And you can see that they're both dressed up in Germanic uniforms. Even though one's King of England, one's the Tsar of Russia, here they are in some nice outfits, Germanic outfits. At that, because they're cousins. Those courts are cousins, you know? So just so you know, there's something going on here. And I wanted to show you Nicholas II, because we talked about him with Rasputin in the Romanovs, how this mystical fellow came in and took over the court. Well, before Rasputin came, there was Papus in Tsar Nicholas. Go to the next image. We've talked about Papus before in different episodes as a mystic, you know, from France. Well,
Martinist power. Right?
Yeah,
Martinism.
Yeah, with Martin de Pasquale, Martin de Pasquale and Saint Martin. We have so much to cover on that stuff too, but just know that Papus made several trips to Russia to speak with Nicholas about the mysticism thing, about empire building. And Papus warned him about Rasputin. He said, be careful. Papus set up some Martinist lodges there.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It deals with empire building. These fellows, you'll see, there's certain groups of people wherever empires are being built, and these certain family members, you'll see these people around, these mystics.
Well, and it's kind of interesting because Papus is the kind of person you want to talk to, because what's wild about Papus is he's the reinvigorator of the Martinist order. He's starting to bring back all this Rosicrucianism. At that time in France, it kind of had been waning. And then he becomes this revitalist figure who brings everything back, connects to that De Pasquale and whatnot. But, a real wild man in his own right. And clearly a myth builder, a revitalizer,
Yep. And at this time, at the turn of the century, let's say 1900, we talked about 1905 before, and when they're all meeting up, Theodore Roos being the head of the OTO, but being a Prussian spy police force. Crowley is sent in, McMathers, Golden Dawn, all these Theosophy, all these people are intersecting in the royal courts, helping shape empires.
And there's some of this where it gets into the weird radical wildness, right? So Papus also wrote a lot of anti-Semitic writings, and was also connected, even though, he never joined modern, mainstream Freemasonry. He considered Martinism part of it and organized an international Freemasonic conference. And the OTO were there, and he got inducted into the OTO, and he became friends with Rius, and they agreed on a lot of this extremist racial ideology, which then would be later removed by Crowley and kind. So the OTO does kind of have this dark Russo-Germanic past and this racial kind of thing going on. And the speculation again is, did Crowley involve himself in the OTO in order to undermine it and its anti-Semitic, nationalistic, Russian Germanic stuff? Because again, we got to remember, right? The Russian Empire is aligned with Germanic interests at this time. In Rius, he's connected to that Germanic bloodline power, right? Just like what we saw with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, connected to the Jacobite bloodline, and trying to help the guy in Spain there overthrow and perform a coup d'état. This is serious freaking stuff that's going on in these orders. And a lot of them are extremist, far-right monarchists.
Yep. And but Blavatsky too had a big hand in it, in the myth building, these Aryan myths. And then she hightailed it at the end to India to mess about in their politics.
Yeah, she's deeply connected. Yeah, Blavatsky is no angel here. She's a part of all this racial nonsense too, and was connected to Rius, right? And she gets out of there. So
we're this is the turn of the century. This is 1900s, early 1900s. Say 1913. There's a Lama publishes a book. And these are these Buddhist Russian Lamas that are, and they, like I said, they believe that Saint Catherine was the reincarnation of the White Terra. And he publishes a book. This came out in 1913, saying that the Romanovs were directly descended from Sukandra, the legendary king of Shambhala. And so
now that's some powerful myth making.
Yeah, no, even before Heinrich Himmler. So Himmler in World War II packaged it all up. There was a lot of fertile material to work with right here, between Blavatsky, these Russian Lamas, Gurdjieff, everyone's interconnected in this. The OTO, Golden Dawn, it gets pretty spicy. We got
to remember is that this part of India, right? in Tibet and all of this, it's a major crossroad of the entire world, and all of these spiritual things are coming through there, and all of these major powers are coming through there. Afghanistan, people are fighting over this like you wouldn't believe, right? The Russians are in there, right? At this time, we're talking about, we'll get deep into it with my presentation on Gurdjieff, but we're talking about the great game in terms of the battle between the British and the Russian Empire over India, Tibet, and Afghanistan, right? This is the history in the early 1900s.
Well, and the thing is, I showed you the picture. They're both cousins, though.
Yeah.
You know, so at that, let's get into that a little bit. Okay, so the same year that they published the book about the Lamas saying that the Romanovs are just, because they had to start building myths, saying, well, the other ones were like, well, we're descended from the Pendragons. The others were like, well, we're descended from Shambhala. And so that's for myth builders. So check it out. They have the celebrations for the 300th year anniversary of the House of Romanov. And that's that same year that book comes out, saying that the Romanovs are descended from Shambhala. There's a certain individual named Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff is the name, and he speaks at the Tsar's court and gives speeches for support. And now this Gurdjieff, people say he's Gurdjieff, because there's people later on that saw him and goes, hey, there's Gurdjieff. And he goes, no, that's Gurdjieff. Now I'm going to get a little more into this. Go to the next picture. All right. And so for this, we got to start with this character right here, the 13th Dalai Lama. This is the one before the Dalai Lama that we see now. This is the one before that, because we know that this certain Gurdjieff became his tax collector and tutor, you know, and and it's in history. And there's people say, well, that's Gurdjieff. And what happened eventually in 1922, Gurdjieff tried to move to England, and he was denied by the foreign office. Says, nah, we know who you are, Gurdjieff. You can't come here. Because Britain had invaded Tibet in 1904. And this is like the 1920s right here, you know, let's say. In between that period, from 1900 to 1920s. Go to the next image. All right. You know what? I'll let you talk about this character right here if you want to set this up right here before you go deeper later.
Okay, so Gurdjieff is a wild man and a very interesting character, right? Born in 1866 in Greek-speaking part of Turkey, Armenia, but before Armenia is really a nation, and he comes from a Pontic Greek-speaking minority. And a really interesting character. His father was a bard. Father was a traditional bard, and he has it's really hard to say much about Gurdjieff, his early life, because it is so caught up in mythology and myth making. And it's largely the only two sources we have are Gurdjieff himself, and then later on his followers. So a lot of the stories of Gurdjieff comes from his books, part of his series, All in Everything. We know that the character of Beelzebub is a hypnotist and is an allegory for Gurdjieff. So a lot of scholars look through that book for stuff about his life. But then later on in the third part, he writes pretty extensively about his life in the third series. But again, right, it's all biased, and Gurdjieff was a notorious liar. And he would exploit everything with Gurdjieff is about the work, and everything is about pushing you into the work. So you can't trust anything that Gurdjieff says outside of the fact that he's trying to bring out the best in you and force a confrontation to bring strife. So it gets really confusing when we're dealing with this man. So what ends up happening with Gurdjieff is, so he winds up meeting up with some interesting characters. His claim is he finds these 7 truth seekers, these 7 seekers after truth. And they start traveling around their area and doing, like, at this time, you know, you got to understand we're talking in the 1870s, in the 1880s, right? Archaeology is still modern. Most anthropologists are what we would call armchair anthropologists. They're taking other people's stuff and they're bringing it back to their big academic universities in England and Germany, and they're reading it there without talking to anyone and making up their own opinions without ever talking to the individuals there, without ever going. Well, Gurdjieff and his crew, they're going to these places, you know? Now, again, it's all cut up in myth making, and I don't want to get too deep into that, but he winds up exploring Greece for a while and looking at these in Turkey and Armenia and looking at these various national sites. And this is eventually he winds up going to Egypt, meeting a character and going to Egypt. He winds up going to Tibet. And while throughout all these experiences, he meets these various masters who impart various magical skills on him. And it's all related to a lot of this Sufi magic and Tibetan magic. Gurdjieff really bridges the gap between Sufism and Buddhism and sort of modern psychotherapy, because he was a hypnotist trained in hypnotism as well. And a lot of craziness going on there. But eventually what ends up happening is he settles in France and he starts his own radical mystical school. And he kind of, you know, he teaches people how to confront themselves and how to become these empowered selves in order to become what he called the sly man and manifest the third way, which is in between the path of the monastic and in between the path of the householder. And he was all about engaging in the strife. So much of his life, right? He believed that life was impearled by strife. So he travels around throughout the Russian Revolution to these horrible areas of revolution, throughout World War I to where there's fights going on. You know, he puts himself in the thick of things constantly. Yeah, fourth way. Thank you for the correction, D-Love.
Yeah, the fourth way.
Not third way, fourth way, you know. But by the time he gets to France, he sets up a school. He starts teaching people. He gets in a car accident and he receives the revelation and he starts writing his book, Beelzebub's Tales, to his grandson, which is part prophecy, part modern myth, part satirical myth, part satirical science fiction. It's there's so much going on with Gurdjieff. It's hard to pierce the surface. And then outside of Gurdjieff, you have all of the people that then build off of his work, such as Uspensky, and we'll get into it with my stuff, Bennett, which was one of his students. And a lot of our information on our Gurdjieff comes from these students, people who worked closely with him. Like you brought up the stories about him being the Lama, right? And for example, his student J.D. Bennett went and looked into this, and he claims it's not true. But he does claim that Gurdjieff fought in the Tibeto War in the Great Game and was probably a spy. And there's all this weird stuff, like Gurdjieff claims he meets this magical order called Sarmong. And then there's a Tibetan monastery that's Samong. It's almost the exact same wording, but slightly different, you know? So there's and his teachings do bridge the gap. There's this deep Bacchic, Greek, Christian, and Sufi kind of Islamic mystical stuff. You know, that stuff that I love, that I'm so into. That Bacchic tradition, Gurdjieff's got that 100%. And he also has kind of this weird Buddhist element to it too. And he is going to these places. He goes to Egypt. He goes to Tibet. He's traveling across Siberia, right? At this wild, war-torn time, you know? And eventually he comes to Europe and he sets up his magical school and he teaches people. Yeah, wild stuff.
Well, you said he had the mustache.
Yes. Oh, yeah, that's one thing that's so interesting. So part of the reason why he's able to travel all across these places and engage these people and engage into these various cultures is because he looks like them and he can speak their language. He was such an autodidactic learner, and he spoke all these various languages, many just partially. But if you look at him with that big mustache, he looks like a Turk. He looks like a Greek. He looks like a Tibetan man. To the right people, they would just see that mustache and welcome him in. So we're other people, you know, like you have these tales of European explorers trying to go to these places, and they're like, no, you can't come in. No, we're not talking to you. But Gurdjieff was welcome. Gurdjieff was welcome, you know, and that's part of what makes him so special. And he even talks about this at one point being a detriment to him, and he gets saved by his harmonica. So okay, while he's out in these civil war areas, and there's all this nationalistic revolutionary fervor, various tribes that would look at him and think he was part of the other tribe, and then they would go talk to him, and all they would recognize is that he had a foreign accent, and so they'd be like ready to kill him, but he'd bring up the spirituality, and he'd play his mouth harp. He had this like jaw harp, and he'd sing songs from his childhood that his father taught him, Bard, Sufi stuff, Bhaktic stuff, and it saved his life. You know, so sometimes looking like an everyman was a problem, but you know, it's also, this is a huge reason why I'm almost certain that Gurdjieff was a spy, because the British and the Russian governments targeted people like him, highly educated people who could pretend to be spiritual seekers and could move among these tribal groups. These were people who were able to cross boundaries. You know, you see this across India, Asia, and, you know, in Tibet. They have this special reverence for these mystical men. And Gurdjieff is one of them. And there are hundreds of spies like him, you know. Crowley is like that for the European audience. He can infiltrate our secret societies. Gurdjieff is like this for the Central State audience. He can infiltrate their secret societies, you know.
Speaking of the great game, you know, the players of the great game, and how the myth is that he was making myths for Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia. That's the cousin of, in Britain, they're fighting over. Cousins are fighting over this part of the world right there, Tibet. Britain had invaded it, Russia wanted it, and they're making myths as to who can own it. And so looking at his mustache, go to the next image. All right. Because here's the players right here in the game of the great game at the bottom. And they're next to each other wearing German outfits. That's George V and Nicholas II. One is the King of England, one is the Tsar of Russia. And they're fighting over Tibet and Afghanistan and different places, the world, actually everything. And all the people surrounding them are their cousins. Everyone's interrelated. They're all cousins. You know, at the top left is Kaiser Wilhelm. Next to him is Alfonso XIII, King of Spain. Next to him is Umberto, King of Italy. Next to him is Franz Joseph, who was the emperor of the Austrian Hungarian Empire. The bottom left is, actually, if you go to the bottom right, that's his brother. That's Franz Joseph's brother, Maximilian. We talked about him, Emperor Maximilian of Mexico. He sent his brother to Mexico. They killed him. You know, and the one at the far left is Philip and of Orleans. You know, and he was deposed as part of that Napoleonic stuff in the revolutions in France, and his father. That actual picture, he went to fight in the Confederate War in America.
You know what this is about? This is ancient European tribal nonsense. This goes all the way back to the Franks. We know about this from the Roman writers, because when the Roman writers started to first encounter the Germanic tribes, the Frankish tribes, they all would sport the mustache. In fact, you could not call yourself a Frankish man if you did not have the mustache. And they also used to have these kind of like long hair type mullet things, but the mustache was the defining feature that made one a Frank. This is before the division of French and German, right? We're talking, this is before even Karl. Karl becomes the defining feature of this, right? Of that tribe and that look. Karl of the Carolingians. And you all had to have that blood, right?
You know, and so between 1850 to like 1930, they're competing. over who gets to be King Solomon, who gets to run the world. And you need your Eastern kingship, because remember back in the day you had a two-pope system, Constantinople and Rome. So you got to have your dual empire. And this is like the remnant of the Holy Roman Empire. This is them fighting over who gets to be King Solomon. And they're all cousins. They're Queen Victoria, the great-great-grandmother. They're interrelated, and they're on each house. So you think it's Spain, but they're intermarried with Austria. You think it's France, they're intermarried with Prussia. Everyone's intermarried, and you may have a nationalistic element, but the monarchy is Prussian. It's part of it. It's Germanic, Teutonic, Austrian, Bavarian. At that, and they fought over myths as well. And all these people, they're overthrown. Are they interconnected to occultists? And are they battled Freemasons at that? The Freemasons is a part what overthrew these monastic empires. They set up these revolutions. Go to the next image.
It should be no surprise. Again, remember everyone, what is the motto of France? Equality, liberty, and fraternity. What are the motto of the Freemasons? Equality, liberty, and fraternity. What's happening in America? What's happening in France? You know, what's happening with the Illuminati? These things were far more enlightenment oriented in bringing equality and manifesting democracy than anything else.
You know, because at a certain point, too, oh yeah, at a certain point, Franz Ferdinand gets killed.
Oof.
You know, and so it was Franz Joseph was too old at that point. You know, the emperor of the Habsburg, Austrian, Hungarian Habsburg Empire. You know, and Franz Joseph, at one point, he went to Russia in 1848 when he was losing, getting his ass kicked, and kissed the hand of Nicholas for support. Nicholas the first, the father of Nicholas II. He kissed his hand and said, and they sent him Russian troops, and they protected the Austrian Hungarian Empire. Was going to get their asses kicked. You know, but Franz Joseph had a tough one. They assassinated Franz Joseph. They assassinated his brother Maximilian. They assassinated his wife and his son. His son Rudolph committed suicide. Everyone around him was murdered for this great game that's empire building stuff. And what happened right here eventually, his heir apparent, Franz Ferdinand, was shot by a young Serbian guy, 17-year-old, just walked up and bam, bam, for a reason. Go to the next image. And this is the reason why. He was part of something called the Black Hand.
Oh, wow.
And it's a Serbian secret society called the Black Hand. And they got their skull and bones right there. And they also got a little poison bottle. When you see the imagery on the far left, that little image is a bottle of poison. They also poisoned as well. And it was part of, you know, last time we talked about the Evidence Bureau, which was the secret police of the Habsburg dynasty, because they had to police 17, you know, different languages, all these different little countries. And eventually these different countries are like tired of this stuff. They want their own independent countries and nationalities. And so, you know, it could have been Serbia, Hungary, it could have been Romania, Montenegro. One of them was going to do it, you know, throw off the yoke. Because this is the time of revolutions around the world, from like 1848 through 1950, let's say. The whole world is all these, every one of those dudes gets thrown off the throne.
Time bombs. I remember in school, one of my professors just telling me, you know, it was one of these things. Everyone had signed an agreement with everyone else. They were just waiting for someone to pull the trigger, right? What was going to be the thing that was going to call all these alliances into action? You know, it was a time bomb waiting to go off. If not from this, something very soon was going to happen, you know?
Yeah. Well, go to the next image. You know, what's weird is Franz Joseph didn't like Freemasons. He said French Freemasons were trying to engineer a war between Russia and Austria. That's what he said. He said these French Freemasons are going to mess it all up, cousin. They're trying to get in between all of us. Well, Go back a couple pictures. I want to just show you those guys again. One more. Yeah, those dudes, all cousins through Queen Victoria, ruling France, Italy, Spain, Russia, Britain, the whole thing with their mustache, same family. Go forward. Back to the, we're all on the throne. And who gets on the set? These homies. In each one of those countries, these homies come. You know, Franco in Spain. It starts with Stalin. You got Stalin.
Well, you mean Lenin.
Lenin, yeah, Lenin, because Stalin comes after him, yeah. Mussolini on the right, showing a statue that it's like some Caesar thing. And then Hitler. It's part of, we can call it fascism, or some people say communism. There's a lot of different ways to play it. They're all a little different. But they're a result of the pushback of the monarchy.
Yeah, it's a pushback in the establishment of a new mythological order, trying to upset the old order and create new myths of power, right? The old myth of power was you had to be related by blood. You had to have that power of blood, and you had to work through these monarchist familial corporations. That's really what wielded power. You know, these individual familial heads, the kings themselves by this point, weren't even in charge anymore, right? It's these familial powers. That's why you got one family with everyone on the throne. It's these corporations that are becoming these incredibly decadent, isolated, you know, singular powers. And of course, the people fucking can't, they get stifled, they get exploited, they get suppressed. You know, we see the grossness of that decadence. And as a result, something has to come. Something has to come. And so we see two invocations of the pole here, right? Two extremes. But ultimately, they're both utopian ideals. They're ultimately both in the manifestation of these new mythic visions of a projected nation that is great and perfect. Whether it exists as this communist ideal or a fascistic ideal, right? They're still embodying that. And in the name of utopia, anything is justified. Anything becomes justified. And the state becomes this, you know, this manifestation of the will of this idea, of this myth, you know? Like in early communist society, you have all these people sacrificing themselves willingly, working themselves to death in the name of the state, you know? And just like we see within fascism, all of these people signing up to go to war, to protect and defend that state, or to purge elements of the state that are deemed as a virus, right?
You know, this bad element in a lot of these cases could be Jewish.
Yep.
They've built a myth of this anti-Jewish, this anti-Semitic thing. Part of it, because behind these people too, because I showed the monarchy, I showed the dictators who came after the monarchy, but behind them, that the people that never went away were the bankers and the churches.
Well, and this is also really important to talk about, is the power of satire and the power of hate, and how oftentimes these new world orders still utilize old world hate. Okay, look at this. There's no, okay, Franco, Hitler, and Mussolini are all Catholic, right? Now, Hitler may have abandoned Catholicism, but Mussolini gave the Vatican its own country status, right? And these people were deeply connected to that Catholic worldview and the worldview of that ancient holy empire that they were seeking to revitalize in a new iteration, right? And what is one of the essential myths of that is scapegoating of the Jewish people. That anti-Semitism is old. It may come to its most evil, disgusting form under, you know, fascist Germany. But this is not something that just came out of nowhere in the European consciousness. This is a myth that has been developed and been stoked by the nobility, by the church, since
blood libel,
you know, since the beginning of Christianity. So by the time you get to here, it's an easily exploited myth that they can jump on, right? That they can drive. It's the same thing with homosexuality, right? This is an easily exploited myth. Transgenderism, easily exploited stuff, you know, and you see the fascists always, the extremists always, right? Even Stalin had his protocols of the elders of Zion, because it's they create these myths to use what they need is they need to create an other. You envision the state through these kind of to me, I always see things through occulted imagery. And fascism is so occulted, and even extremist communism becomes so occulted. You envision the state as a manifestation of the cosmic man, and as the dictator, as the literal embodiment of that cosmic image, as of that eidolon, right? And what happens is the cosmic dictator, right? They recognize the virus in the body politic, in the state, and they have to expunge the virus in order to save the state. They recognize the evil and they remove it. And this is like an easy black and white myth that you can sell your populace. But always what ends up happening is it's never just those people. Now you've empowered a state to create a police force that can go after anyone, that can just attack and destroy. And that's really why they invoke those satirical images of vilification, because it allows you to scapegoat, and it allows you to create a force to enforce this will, to enforce this image of the dictator, to create that national unity through this mythopoetic extremism. It's wildness.
Yeah. And like you were pointing out, the church is behind it, as well as banking structures, as well as the newspapers. Like during World War II, World War I, you have the newspapers around the world are owned by the same families. And so whatever they're printing in each country is whatever they want you to think. And because people made money off these wars. There's a lot of figures on the set. And to me, these are evil people, but they're actors. They did poses, and they kind of taught them to be extra dramatical with their speeches. They trained them. There's a little more to it.
It's one of these things too, like when you look at someone like Mussolini understood that in order to empower himself, he needed to have that myth of church, by giving the church their own country, that gave him so much power in the eyes of the people.
Vatican State, and it had its own sovereign law, and they got the Swiss Guard as the army police force set up there. And at this time, a lot of these monarchical families were thrown out of power. See, like the Kaiser Wilhelm. I showed you the picture of Kaiser Wilhelm earlier. But even earlier on, Kaiser Wilhelm, they had set up Venezuela, meaning Little Venice. People think the Nazis went there in World War II. They were already there way earlier, before World War I. They had set up shop to make a new utopia there. And so a lot of these monarchical houses are overthrown by these dictators, except for in England. Yeah. There, they changed the name from Saxe-Coburg to House of Windsor. Their last name becomes that name of the castle. No one tries to overthrow them. They become a symbol of to protect your country. They become they turn the trick. Instead of being the person suppressing it, like, hey, we need you. We can all fight for you, so they're going to kick our ass.
They go through a mythic cultural conversion, right? And they embody the place. And the English people largely go along with it. It's one of these wild, interesting things,
Well, in modern times, people that fight against that, just so you know.
Well, I mean, they also have to have people like Crowley fighting and destroy for it, because you do get these extremists, right? What was the Golden Dawn about? What was Mathers about? What was, these people wanted a Stuart on the throne. They wanted to return to someone of Scottish or English, UK ancestry, right?
Yep.
They were upset that it was a Germanic bloodline on the throne, whereas Crowley represented that Germanic bloodline. It's wild.
And part of the infighting too with the royal crowns, we don't see it. It's between Bourbon, Savoy, Habsburg-Lorraine, Orleans. There is infighting amongst the royal crowns, even though they're cousins, you could say.
Absolutely.
So talking about Stalin and Lenin, go to the next image. This is Lenin's tomb. he went to great lengths. He was into some weird metaphysical stuff. Even though had some weird, when you look at what they're into, they use the occult to build mythologies, whether they believed it or not. That's what we're told in literature. They were smart enough to know that. But one thing is, he went to great lengths to be buried in this weird cube thing.
We got to remember that Russian communism is born out of Karl Marx's Marxism, right? And it has that as its root. And Karl Marx had a very nuanced vision of religion, right? There's that famous quote, opium of the masses. But people often neglect to understand what opium represents. It represents a painkiller, represents a relief. And so there's this complicated understanding between the power of belief, the power of drugs, the need to use these painkillers in order to bring people into unity, right? The original Marxists, at least in their most pure form under Karl, were not trying to destroy all religion, but rather recognize religion for what it is and see it as a band-aid and something that can never be empowered, something that needs to be observed and kept in check, right?
They utilized it. And so here's Lenin's tomb, this weird cube that's designed based on different levels of cubes, and he's embalmed in there. And at that, they had buried Stalin in there as well for years, until a party member had a weird dream, like in the 1950s, saying that Stalin doesn't want to be there no more. And they put Stalin somewhere else by the Kremlin, outside the Kremlin walls. They built his own tomb because a lady had a vision, a party member. Stalin was into witches too.
Really?
Yeah, he consulted witches. Even though a real dictator, they really don't give a hoot about that stuff because they embody it. It's like a King Solomon thing. They feel they are that energy. But some of them want to know. Some of them want information. Let's say it's just information. They look at psychics as information. Whether they believe it or not. What do you have to say about me being the ruler of everything? It's their ego. It feeds their ego, whether they believe it or not. Let's say. So this is around this time. I'm going to bring you back to 1917. This is post World War II, or this is World War I, before World War II. Go to the next image, because we talked about this lady before. We're going to change up a little bit. Here's Mata Hari, a spy who was actually Dutch. Her name was Marguerite MacLeod, married a man named MacLeod. And she studied actual dance in Java because her husband went there as part of some business, and she was bored, and she took up Javanese dance classes, and she became very good at it. And the name Mata Hari means the eye of the dawn, an Indonesian word. And she came back and she started doing her dancing. Well, she became very popular because she knew it. She learned some really good Javanese dance stuff, and it really enthralled the people. And even though she was a mother and she was a little older, and she made a sensation amongst Europe. And she ended up getting convicted for spying for Germany in World War I.
Wild.
Through her beguiles and through her travels, she was collecting information for the Kaiser Wilhelm and for the team. And she was executed in France. And they cut off her head and kept her head for years. They kept Mata Hari's head. And then we've talked about the act of cutting off the head and using it for divination purposes. Going back to St. John the Baptist, it flew around.
Orpheus.
Yeah. Orpheus. Was it Brammar?
Bran.
Yeah, Bram. Even St. Denis. St. Denis in the plague of the French plague was dipped in the head, the blood of the head of St. Denis. And so that's wild because they cut off her head. They kept it from her body. Just because of her power. And supposedly when she died, when they were shooting her, she blew kisses to the firing squad and made them blush. She was out of her power. She's like, hey, fellas, And they just were like, ah.
So a couple people in chat are new to this idea about the decapitations. Okay, so in the Orphic myth, this is the earliest version I found of this, but I think it probably even goes back further. It seems to be related maybe to the myth of Osiris, but well, certainly it's connected to those. But the head is specifically the first iteration I saw is with Orpheus. So Orpheus is said to break the taboo. He gives up the love of women and he pursues the piratical Herculean path, young boys. And then when he does this, the Maenads flip out on him and they rip him apart in Dionysian frenzy and consume his flesh. And it is said that his head fell onto his lyre and it floated down the ocean and it winds up traveling all the way to the Isle of Lesbos, where it is installed in a temple to Apollo in the Muses and becomes this oracular voice, you know, that then the oracles then use to prophesy with. They use the head for prophecy, right? So totally crazy, crazy story there. Later on, we get the story of Bran. Bran is this great giant king of Wales. And in this story, they're constantly fighting Wales with Ireland. And the goddess Branwen, his sister, which means the white raven, she decides to marry the king of Ireland to try and prevent the war. Marry the king of Ireland to prevent the war. And what ends up happening instead, though, is her evil brother Efnisian at their wedding, when the Irish come, mutilates all the horses. This is such a huge offense to the Irish. They freak the F out. But Bran manages to calm everything down, or at least they think. So the wedding continues. Branwen and the King of Ireland go back to Ireland. When they get to Ireland, though, the Irish court is still all freaked out about the mutilation of the horses, and they blame Branwen. So Branwen becomes a slave, put in the scullery kitchens, made to, and is abused and beaten. So she sings out to the birds. She sings out specifically to the starlings. And the starlings carry her story back to Bran. And Bran mounts an army. And so the very thing she sought to prevent winds up happening. And there's a massive bloody war. And Branwen also at this point during the war brings out her magic cauldron, which can raise the dead. And at this point, Branwen dies. He gets decapitated, but she raises his body. And they fight this huge battle. And they wind up defeating the King of Ireland. They defeat Efnisian, her evil brother. And in the end, everyone dies. Everyone is dead, except for basically Branwen and her cauldron. And she takes the head of Branwen and puts it on a magic shield. And they bring it back to England. And they bury it in this sacred mound, which is then said to become the place that gives birth to London. And all this other kind of wildness.
The tower.
Yeah, old boy gets into it more. He knows the specifics. Don't quote me on all the specifics, but it becomes this huge thing about starting a new bloodline, you know, that is born out of the death of Bran. And Branwen becomes that founder, you know, so interesting stuff. And you should talk about St. John. What's the story with St. John the Baptist? And
well, Salome does a dance of the seven veils and tells her father, as a reward, I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter, on a charging plate at that. And
doesn't that seem to parallel Mata Hari?
And what happens is the head flies around Jerusalem for 3 days, prophesizing about politics, about the Herodian dynasty, about who has the right to rule. All this stuff deals with politics. And even St. Denis, his head that's cut off, it was shown in that Olympics, the past Olympics thing, as part of the imagery, besides the Dionysic stuff. Because the original flag of France there, before the lily, it was called the oriflamme, which is a red flag, which orange flag that had a sun and was dipped in the blood of the head of St. Denis when he was decapitated. And that's in France. So they got an attachment to heads in France. You'll see a lot of, they got a word for it where they put it on the sides of cathedrals. you know. So we're at World War One right here. And speaking of fascist stuff, because you were talking about Mussolini earlier, El Duce. I didn't even throw out the word El Duce. Go to the next image.
Oh
Right
no.
there, there's old El Duce.
Ezra Pound.
Ezra Pound.
Yeah.
No, I didn't know Ezra Pound was like that. I'm like, what?
Oh man, yeah.
Because I have to look at all our poets and authors and Franz Liszt and Rembrandt, whoever. I have to know, what was you into? And Ezra was a very naughty boy. He wanted to make movies. He was hired by El Duce, Mussolini, to make myths, fascist myths at that, because they have something called fascist mysticism. They invented their own school of fascist mysticism. His brother, Mussolini's brother, Alfredo Mussolini, was into that stuff too. They're very naughty boys. But tell us about Ezra.
Ezra is kind of wild. So Ezra, this is so complicated because like he's connected to one of my all-time favorite poets ever, Hilda Doolittle, HD, and they both go in radically opposite directions. Where HD winds up saving thousands of Jews and becomes a hero during World War II with her partner, and Ezra Pound winds up becoming a propagandist for the fascists and writes anti-Semitic literature and refused to recant even after the war's over. He stays to the very bitter end. And then even in the end, after he gets out of jail, he spends his life, kind of forgotten, living in the backwoods of Italy, just depressed and angry. It's a wild story. Ezra Pound is just an incredible poet. And this is what, an incredible artist. He is.
That's what they need. They need that. They need their talent to give life to these myths.
In my mind, when I look at him, Ezra Pound is a hipster before hipsters. He was just a huge hipster. Part of the reason why HD left Ezra is because Ezra always wanted to make her his muse. He wanted to define her. He gave her pen name HD and called her poetry imagiste and tried to package her and sell her. And at first she loved this, but eventually she's just like, dude, I'm not your muse. I'm a creator in my own right. What is your problem? And he got bored with her because he couldn't dictate her. He couldn't use her as an artistic plaything. And they had a really complicated relationship. But eventually he gets obsessed with he was an artistic creator and he became really famous and powerful in England, creating, and in America, creating these poetry magazines and popularizing poets. And he tried to make himself the center of art movements. And eventually people just got annoyed with him because you can't be that kind of tyrannical dude, especially among artists. Even if you're a great artist, people will get fed up with you and they'll push you out, and there'll be a new great inspired person who'll come in and will replace you. It's always the hot person of the moment, right? In art.
Well,
and you can never be
El Duce hired him. El Duce heard about him and said, "Hey, Ezra, come over here and I'll make you a film director. And we'll put the state budget behind you and help us bring this to life."
It's important we talk about this because what happens is that he gets really into futurism and a lot of this kind of abstract art that was really huge at this time. And like he was also really into mythology. So on one hand, he's all into manifesting a new world. But on the other hand, he's deeply connected to the ancient Greek past. And so what he saw in El Duce was a reflection of him, a reflection of these ideas. Someone who's like, I'm going to rebuild Rome, but I'm going to do it in this beautiful new futuristic way.
Mythopoetic futuristic.
Ezra Pound talks about when he first saw the sharp, beautiful suits of the fascists, when he sees, like, there's this really infamous image of Mussolini's like base where he's got his stone face carved into this building of where he used to have his party base. Like, Ezra Pound was an artist and he really fell in love with the art, and he fell in love with that idea of manifesting a Rome. But then he went down the pill too deep. He drank the Kool-Aid. He became a real anti-Semite. And the only reason he didn't get killed is because he was American. The only reason he survived is because he was American. And the Americans took pity on him. But they did throw him in jail for a long time. And he spent the last years of his life, alone in the obscurity. So,
in some Etruscan villa.
yeah,
Well,
wild
speaking
stuff.
of the little salutes, which you see, it's a Caesar thing. They've said that's where they get it from. It's a
Well, it's okay. So this is actually complicated. He gets it. It's not really. He's doing it now because of that statue, but really, this was this was from painting. Part of myth making. Famously, I can't remember the name of the painting, but if you go on Google, you can search this up. But Mussolini saw this famous painting that was a rendition of Caesar giving this gesture, because it says that they made a gesture, but they don't describe the gesture. It was just, it's one of these things where, when you're talking to people in your own culture and your own language, you don't need to say what the gesture looks like. They all know what the gesture is.
Well, just speaking of gestures, let's do some gestures.
Mm.
One hand over the eye, hand on the heart. We've talked about this one. Two hands up. We've seen this in a lot of iconography. Hands out. This one, Egypt, hands crossed of the pharaohs. There's a lot of different hand symbols we could do. We've talked mudras. They talk about this, different things. It's what we call non-vocal language.
Yeah.
This language of symbols, the shadow language, the twilight language, the language of the birds. There's more than one way. Non-verbal communication is the word I was looking for. And these symbols have power. What was the one? This one, Sabazios, or the form to speak.
So there's two variations of it, right? The left and the right. On the left, you're getting the 666, and you're getting the invocation of Sabazios. On the right, you're getting the 99999, infinity. Okay, and you're getting the highest iteration of God, Zeus, or I'm trying to remember the word, but anyway, you're getting the highest version. So it's like that above and below, invoking two sides of the pole, the sun and the black sun. And also, like you said, it was related to that in the Greek symposium. This is the invocation of reason. It's the sign of Apollo, right? Of Zeus, Apollo. It's that I have the power of speech, and I'm going to speak. So I invoke that energy.
What do you do in class when you want to speak?
You raise your hand.
You raise your hand, and it's time for me to speak. And that's what they'll do in class. And speaking of these symbols, like so when they do the Sieg Heil, people talk about the Sieg Heil, the Nazi Sieg Heil. Mm-hmm. Hitler didn't do the Sieg Heil when he was receiving. It was this. You might see this. It's like a glove, like you're catching. The other people are throwing their energy towards him. He's receiving and catching and moving around and going, yep, like a charger plate. Send your energy right here. Here's the tithe box. Send that money right here. These symbols have power. They have power. Peace sign. Hey, somebody flipping you off, giving the finger. We showed that comes from occult symbology of King Solomon as well. These finger symbologies of the king. His Solomon's ring, the seal of Solomon, deals with his finger and pointing it.
Well, we're seeing it right now in right now in our current political moment. We're seeing it on full display. Okay, with those exactly. We have people doing this image to invoke both to prove that they are extremists and also to trigger people, to prove it's all about triggering and offending people, being the most intense, being the one who can cross the line, right? To appear as the me, to embody the idea, to be the greatest troll. It's such ridiculousness and insanity, but even more so about the current moment. What blew my mind recently is I watched a speech by J.D. Vance where he calls all of the people in China peasants. And then all of a sudden I just watched China explode. And they all go like, damn right, we're fucking peasants. Have you read the Red Book? This is part of our Maoist communist identity, man. You could go for it. And you're just seeing that the two different cultural extremes in the satire on full display. Them calling the Chinese peasants is like just empowering them,
It's a paisano. Call me the paisano. Call you the polis of the people. to be of the people. That's why these movements overthrow those people. They get tired of that. That's what happened.
Yeah.
But speaking of this salute stuff, just so we don't go to the next image.
Yeah.
Well, right there, because look at real quick before I even show you the next image. That's the son. Remember, we're talking about Nicholas II and George. Well, he died, and his son came into power, and the son Edward abdicates as the King of England before World War II. He's like, nah, I want to go on the other team. I want to go fight with the other guys and get his Iron Cross. That's what he was into. And because our family is really the lead family from here anyways. So, go to the next image. Go to this next image, though. That's what I want to show you.
Most people are going to know this guy through that terrible movie, The King's Speech, which totally romanticizes him and doesn't mention any of his political nonsense. Such ridiculous stuff.
He seems pretty enamored. Right, so there's Queen Elizabeth doing the little Elon Musk salute, the little showing her love. Daddy taught her. In the far right, you would see Edward showing her how to do that after he got back from Germany and learned the new salute. Hey, this is how the family does it back home. This is how we show who that we're the Kaiser, because Kaiser means Caesar. So just showing you that the symbology, the occultism, the bloodlines, the families, this great game, this story is a lie. Nothing is what it seems. And like I said, I'm not showing you the bankers and the Catholic Church and the religions behind this stuff. But there's a lot going on here. Our history books don't teach all this. We don't get Aleister Crowley as a spy and, all this goofy stuff. And so behind all these people that are in control of these countries are occultists.
Myth-makers, more than okay, it's not just occultists, because to say occultists is too limited, but it's always the myth makers and the artists, right? One of the greatest things that just blows my mind when I talk to a lot of, like, Dion, you are in the heartland of propaganda, of Hollywood, of the creation of the American ideal. And I think North American people are the most propagandized people in the world. And most of them don't even recognize that they're being propagandized.
They eat it for breakfast. They love it. So put some sugar on it. Ooh,
they don't even
know more, please.
Yeah. It's so crazy, right?
Well, propaganda tastes good. It confirms our confirmation bias. And when done right, it can program us through nonverbal communication, through symbols, through imagery, through stories, to trigger our feeling-based nature. We got a left and right nature.
It's never just propaganda, right? Like, how do you sell modern propaganda? You also tell the hero's myth. You also invoke the gods, right? You make it Marvel superheroes, man. It's insane. Yep. It's insane,
So at this time, they had to build some nationalist myth. They tore down the monarchy of all these countries in Europe. And now each country had to build up their myths. So they went back to their occultists and their artists and their intellectuals and said, build us each of us a myth of why our country is special and why we, And so let's go to the next image. One homie that did that in Germany was Himmler. Heinrich Himmler. He said, well, hey, we can take Blavatsky. We got that Gurdjieff. Just put some Steiner, a little Waldorf style schools. Let's incorporate this. And there's some stuff in California. They've been doing this eugenic research out there. Boom, boom. Let's incorporate this stuff together. Some Nordic stuff.
It's so much sadder than this. It's even so much sadder than this. Okay. The Germans, there's a lot to be critical of that early academia that was coming out at this time in the 1800s, but it was also the best anthropology and archaeology in the world at this time. It's so sad that the National Socialists ruined a lot of that beautiful culture and history, because there is a grain of truth here. Like, there is an Indo-Aryan language root. There is an Indo-Aryan connection between all of these cultures. There's a reason why Ireland and Iran are invoking that same idea of greatness in the etymology of their names. There's a reason why you see these demonic spirits all across Europe and Asia. But these guys ruined it through their mythopoeic construction. They took something, they twisted it, and they shat all over it.
Pulled in, let's take a swastika. Let's get that swastika. Let's grab something from there. Then boom, boom, boom. And they packaged it up into a nationalistic religion, state, legal system. Viril, V-R-I-L. Thule,
Thule, you gotta know that guy. Yeah, Vril, ancient power.
Yep, in Thule society. Heinrich, all right, not all the Nazis were the same. Some were into state, some were into military, some were into the church, some were into the cult. Heinrich was the cult one, and he packaged it all up together to turn them into this modern Templars that need to take over the world in the name of to get their tribe back. When it's packaged just right, it sounds good, and people are picking on you. You're poor. Your cousins to the left and right are messing with you. The foreigner, the enemy, member of the East, that foreigner, always that Eastern foreigner's there again, messing with us. And it was engineered by people.
And constructed, totally engineered and constructed, and it comes out of modern myth making and other stuff too. Like, okay, you brought up Vril. Well, everyone should immediately know that from a really infamous, crazy occultist, a great writer, but an abusive, crazy person nonetheless, is Lord Bulwer Lytton. Lord Bulwer Lytton. And the Vril was part, it was part anthropology. It was based on a lot of what was considered modern archaeology and anthropology at the time, but it is a science fiction occult novel, right? It is a pulp novel. And then this becomes the foundation of this, plus Helena Blavatsky and Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy become
and Gurdjieff, a little Rene Gagnon.
And Gurdjieff.
Rene Gagnon.
Yeah, and you can't forget the traditional. Well, that's more Mussolini, but yeah, the traditionalists are in there as like a dirty stick in the mud, right? You cannot forget the Catholics, no matter what. But all of this nonsense comes together to create a myth. But I want, it's like people are building upon this. It starts earlier, right? It starts with people like Bulwer Lytton. And then the National Socialists take his myth and they expand upon it and they twist it, turn it into something different, use it to empower themselves, right?
So he packages it up, gets his castle, buys his castle there in Germany, puts Black Sun mythologies all up in the thing. They start having rituals and wearing swords and lighting fires, and while they banned that stuff amongst the regular people. Behind the scenes, they was practicing this stuff the same way as all these people you'll see, and all these fascist homies, and they're very authoritarian on the outside, and we don't got time for this nonsense. But behind the scenes, they love the nonsense. Ooh.
Really, because fascism is really about in and out groups, and you create the in group can do whatever they want, and the out groups are subjected to rigid hierarchical control and enslavement.
Yep.
And that's what it is. The people in the in group, no laws apply. But to the people out, all of the laws apply and will beat you for anything. Like, it's so wild.
So at this time, we're going back full circle to a few years earlier when it was Gurdjieff messing about with the 13th Dalai Lama. Well, now Heinrich Himmler is sending expeditions to Tibet, because he wants a piece of that too. He wants a piece of that power. You heard of the 7 years in Tibet thing?
Shambhala. They're looking for Shambhala. They're looking for Gurdjieff's Sarmang Monastery. They're looking for that ancient Aryan root that's going to prove that they're that the real heartland of humanity is in the Himalayas and not Africa. And that our real origin is white and not black. All this crazy nonsense, We'll
go to the next image. All right, so here's Hitler. The dude next to him, the little homie, Heinrich Harrer.
Heinrich what, sorry?
Heinrich Harrer.
Okay.
And he's the guy who does the 7 years in Tibet. Maybe that's the Brad Pitt character. I don't know.
Yeah.
But, I don't know. I don't know who it is, but I'm not sure. All I know is Heinrich became the Dalai Lama's tutor. This Nazi homie went there and tutored the 14th Dalai Lama. Just like the other Dalai Lama was tutored by some other homie, this other mystic. This guy sent there. And the other homies they have with them, they would measure the craniums of people's heads. That whole thing with craniology to determine, all this weird anthropology stuff. And go to the next image. And here's that same guy with the Dalai Lama years later. Like, that's my main homie, the little Nazi homie. Loving him. Like, hey, homie, like, oh, you, I miss you. Remember when we'd sit there and talk about Tibet ruling the world? Because Tibet used to be ass kickers. Like, people think of them as like a taken over nation by China, which is true. They did, do some bad things to them. But back in the day, Tibet was Mongolian style. That's their over the hill right there. And they were a warrior nation that used to pick on people. And they were famous for being tough asses. Well, and no one kicked their ass. And they had Bon Po before they had Buddhism. And they did black magic.
Well, what it is that the Mongolian Empire, they gave special charter to Tibet and Bhutan and allowed these to become these empowered religious centers and turned over these nation states to monks and allowed them to run free and do whatever the heck they want. And people have this really like enlightened vision of, what that would mean. They think it's like this beautiful religious society. No, you've got this crazy religious organization that prioritizes itself above all else. You got rape, you got slavery, you got cannibalism.
That's right.
You got the most
psychedelic cannibalism at that, eating dead bodies to get high. You got prostitutes for the monks. They got these trans boys up in the monastery. They ate
when I'm reading Gurdjieff, there's this one line that's so wild where he's just talking, because he's always in the thick of it in all these wars traveling around the world. And he's talking about the power of women to infiltrate and how women are the best spies. And they're like, well, what do you mean women are the best spies? And he goes, the cops fuck the prostitutes. The cops arrest the prostitutes, turn them into marks, and then let them loose. You always ask the cops, they'll know where the spies are, they know where the prostitutes are. It's like, what the hell, man? You're telling me Gurdjieff is not a spy? Like, geez, that's wildness.
So, I want to show just a couple more few pics real quick to drive home World War II and some of the characters in World War II. Go to the next image. All right. So this is World War II. We're fighting Nazis, people around the world, the Allies and different stuff. In the top left corner, Agent 488, Carl Jung, was called into duty, worked with the Allies. They said he was a very important asset. What did he do? What did he do for them? Well, he did like the movie The Silence of the Lambs. Remember Clarissa Starling? He profiled Hitler and Himmler and Hess. And they said it was invaluable what he did. That helped give them insight into these fools. Meaning you could send bombs out to get them and assassins, but that profiling is necessary to know what their next step is and what their weaknesses are. Carl Jung. Because, Steiner, they pulled in Steiner mythology, but Steiner eventually turned on them. Freud was against them, and Jung was against them.
Almost everyone turned against the Nazis, and the Nazis turned against everyone. That's what people feel like. They're extremists beyond extreme,
Oh, yeah. Well,
eventually, like Hitler even got rid of all the Bibles in the Catholic churches and replaced them with Mein Kampf. Even no one was exempt by the end.
Well, they fought them different ways. I'll go down to the bottom corner there. Ernest Hemingway, who was part of the French resistance. He was one of the leaders of the French resistance. And he used to patrol off the coast of Cuba in his fishing boat, trying to find German U-boats to shoot at him with the shotguns. He didn't care. All drunk out there drinking and whiskey. Where you at, you Nazis? Ernest Hemingway. Above, we have Julia Child. She was a spy, intelligence, and she helped design chemicals. She was involved in chemical warfare.
Okay, you got to tell me the story. You're
No,
blowing my
yeah, but
mind.
she has some kind of degrees in chemicals. Besides just doing the cooking,
It makes sense. I mean,
you know,
chemistry
she
is
was an
cooking of
asset. She
another
helped make
kind.
chemical weapons, and she is intelligence, part of intelligence. But you know, the one on the I want to go to the bottom left.
Is that Fritz Joshua?
No, that is Gerald Gardner,
Gerald? Okay.
looking all
Yeah.
crazy.
There's
Probably
a
out
lot of
there
these crazy white-haired dudes.
yep,
Jacobite Gerald Gardner.
he's out there
Crazy
probably
white.
watching women dance around the fire naked because he told them that's what you had to do to invoke ISIS or something, you know, with this
Yeah.
weird
You
pseudo
need to have
religion.
your masculine God and your feminine God, and they got to make love. And I am the masculine God, and you must make love to me. Ooh, Gerald, you're
Well,
freaking weird.
well, one thing he did do amongst all the nonsense was he got his peoples together and he said, you know, let's do something called the cone of power. Since Hitler and Heinrich Himmler are doing these magical spells, they knew what they're up to. They're like, why don't we just draw some pentagrams and dance around the fire naked and let's send energy towards them? And they attempted it. A bunch of witches got together in England during the war and they said, hey, let's light that fire. Let's send that energy.
Well, Gardner wasn't the only one who was doing that. There was also famously Dion Fortune. Now, she's problematic in her own right, but she had this letter correspondence of all of these empowered magicians and witches who were all engaged in, like, she would create a ritual and then get them to empower her ritual through prayer and manifestation, and yeah, they were working together to combat the Nazis through occulted magic.
Yeah, love it. Because that's what it's occulted magic to begin with.
Remember in my presentation, I can't remember my presentation when we were talking about from yesterday or last time with Crowley. Crowley was involved in World War II. He was trying to infiltrate the neo-Nazis. He was trying to infiltrate them, trying to prove that he was like them by writing similar pamphlets and whatnot. And he was already connected with the OTO and whatnot. And that was later on corroborated by several different members of MI5 and MI6. That
We'll go to the next
didn't know
thing.
if he was connected, but he certainly thought he was connected, and he
Go to the
certainly
next bit.
thought he was helping. It's like,
all right, because we're talking about the OTO.
The protege.
Now, the OTO was originally infiltrated because of the Prussian spy that was ahead of it.
Yeah,
and then this dude becomes the head of the OTO America at a certain point over here, and he's building rockets.
Mm-hmm.
He's building rockets. This deals where we get rockets, occultism, and world wars. That's what a magician does at a certain point. He's building bombs. This is the King Solomon. We talked about those fire pots, the Solomonic pots. That's what Parsons was doing. He was taking the energy and condensing the gin and using it. And things happened with the homie. He got into the OTO, the occult side of it. They started doing rituals. They wanted to bring back Lady Babylon, Lady Scarlet Woman. He's out there having sex with L. Ron Hubbard in the desert. Go to the next image.
He does a lot of insane shit.
L. Ron Hubbard right here in his fake ass Navy outfit. This fool right here. What he did was he hooks up with Jack Parsons, who was a real scientist. Actually helped JPL, like rockets, really invented shit that we use in science. But he was crazy, would get high, wanted to do crazy stuff. This homie comes along and co-empowers him, validates his stuff, all of his weird stuff. Like, yeah, we should do that. We should get this chick pregnant and turn her into the Scarlet Woman. We won't tell her, and we'll have her birth the Antichrist and all this stuff. And they go into the desert and start sword fighting each other and doing crazy stuff. Now, these homies, at a certain point, L. Ron goes, you know what? Because L. Ron was into rockets too, but writing about rockets. Where Jack Parsons created rockets and would blow himself up over it, L. Ron would write about rockets and write about space and different things, Ray Bradbury style stuff, and took his girl, got with his girl. But what he really did was he took Jack Parsons' boat, a giant boat, and all of his money, his bank account. And so, because people talk about L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology has a navy and he had these boats, and no, that's Jack Parsons' boat. He stole Jack Parsons' boat. That's where your fake ass navy comes from. Yeah, and his girlfriend and his money. Went to Florida, go hide out. But because they're all assets of the government and are utilized and used for propaganda purposes, L. Ron was allowed to stay around, until they poisoned his ass out at sea. And that's where the next episode, when we get into modern propaganda and politics. But I just wanted to show you this OTO nonsense that's been going on since Theodore Roos and the Prussian police spies and Aleister Crowley trying to infiltrate it and occult politics. It ends up with Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard in America.
Well, it's so wild too, because when I've done a fair amount of reading now and listening to podcasts and stuff about the relationship between these two men. And what I fundamentally see is that Jack Parsons was a true believer. He was a true believer. He really bought in. Whereas Crowley was only interested in the power of myth to manipulate. And he saw in Thelema, and he saw in all of the magic that Crowley was doing, the power to create his own mythology and empower himself and to enslave others.
Yeah. Scientology, he called it.
And so he literally first tried it out on Parsons. He's like, this is the most brilliant guy I know, but he's a true believer. Can I manipulate and rip off a true believer? Right? And he flipping fucking did. And most of his stuff is just nonsense. It's like, he's such a crazy man. He was just a consummate liar. He would just write and constantly storytell. There's this famous image of him where at one point, he was the most prolific writer in human history, and he would just literally just bullshit for hours and hours and hours on end. He got in the habit of writing on these large butcher's rolls of paper. He'd buy, because paper was too expensive, and he's writing so often. You get these butcher's rolls and would just be high on speed and would write for like 12, 16 hours straight. Just the trashiest comic book space hero.
You know what the best thing he did? His best work was what is it called? Battleship Earth?
Battlefield Earth.
Yeah.
Johnny Goodboy Tyler.
John Travolta did it. I'm telling you, that's the best movie. That's the best work ever. You should watch that one if you want to have yourself a good time. Now, go to the next image.
No.
Go to the next image, because I only got a couple more images. Now, speaking of rockets and occultism and myth making and this and that, left and right, and who's there, who's here, this is Werner Braun. You could tell who he is. He's the one that's different than the other ones. He ain't wearing his little Nazi outfit. He's in his black little hipster suit looking all cool, because he's the one who invented the rockets. He's the one who could blow shit up like Parsons. And he had a different relationship with energy than they did. When homie was like 12 or 14 years old, he was busted in Germany and took him to the police station because he took his wagon and put rockets on it and was going down the village, the town square, in a rocket ship wagon at the age of 14 and arrested. But they put him to work. Eventually, at World War II, he comes over to America with half of the homies. The other half go to Russia, just so you know. All the top scientists at the end of the war go to, and this is the great game between Russia and America and England and these same families for control. But Werner is very special in the things he invented and the things he did. And his family was special, the Brown family in Germany. Because in America, they became special. In California, they have found a lot of stuff going back to even the turn of the century in San Bernardino, with a lot of different occulted stuff going on there, up into Pat Brown and Jerry Brown, the governors there in California. And with the popes, they had private meetings with the popes, and they were conscripted. They even administered some of the Rockefeller Trust. The Brown family has always been super connected, and that's why Werner came here after World War II. And he set up not NASA. He set up the American stuff for them. After this, just gone on a boat, came over, and just changed teams. No problem. But go to the next image, and we'll really drive it home. My last image. There he is next to Walt Disney. Because one of his main jobs after World War II was building the rides at Disneyland. Yeah. So what are we talking about?
Again,
in terms of mind control,
comes full circle into the propaganda stuff, right? Jack Parsons made props for Hollywood. He made special effects, right?
Yeah. That's what we live in. We live in a manufactured reality, the Fourth Reich. That's where we live, the Fourth Reich. This European monarchies, World War I, World War II, things happened, they changed. assets are moved around on a chessboard. You're in Canada, I'm here in America, whatever. We're still, on paper, we're subjects to these people.
Yeah.
In a banking sense. Now, in terms of who we are, we're sovereign beyond all this shit. Nobody gives a shit. Make believe. We live in the present moment, and I'm only accountable to the present moment and now, my reality around me. This is still make believe stuff, but it's interesting.
It's so wild. It's so wild. What a great presentation. Thank you, Dion. Truly, truly appreciate it. A lot of fun here. Wildness. Okay, so we're going to go now to my presentation here. So we're going to be talking about this ridiculous gentleman, this magical mystical man, G.I. Gurdjieff. G.I. Gurdjieff. And we already talked a little bit about him. We know that he is this he comes from a magical family of bards in this Armenian Pontic Greek speaking diasporic community. But what I wanted to really explore with Gurdjieff wasn't so much the magic that he was about or any of that. We're focused here just on this idea of espionage and how he's involved. Okay. And so when I went into Google, it was kind of wild. I just searched Gurdjieff spy. And then I happened to find this really interesting article from this great website here. So this article originally inspired a lot of what I found here. I used a lot of the sources that they brought my attention to. So I just wanted to give them a shout out. If you guys want to read the original article, it's called josephhaziz.com. Was Gurdjieff spied on? So they're really asking the question, was he spied on? And in a roundabout way, they prove also that he was a spy. So let's see here. First, I wanted to take out this book, which is talking about the Great Game, this battle between the Empire of England and the Empire of Russia fighting over India and Tibet and Afghanistan, right? And this is happening around the time that Gurdjieff is alive, the 1860s, all the way up to like the 1910s. And Gurdjieff is in the thick of all of this in the moment. So the next few quotes are coming from this book, Intelligence and Imperial Defense by Richard J. Popplewell. So the first quote here I got for you. This is just setting the scene so we understand about the Great Game. The exploration, espionage, and intrigue which the British and Russians conducted in Afghanistan and Central Asia by the British and Russian empires in the period of 1810 to 1907 is commonly referred to as the Great Game. The term was coined in the early 19th century by one of the British participants in this struggle, but only became famous after the publications of Kipling's novel. Okay, so then there's this thing he talks about, different categories that the British would target in order to become spies, and the category that stood out to me most was this third category of people. So this is what they have to say about the third category. The third category of intelligence gathering were Indian hillmen, whom the British recruited to go into areas too dangerous for Europeans, even in disguise. The British chose these men for their exceptional intelligence and trained them in the arts of clandestine surveying. Before sending them across the frontier, often in the disguise of Muslim holy men or Buddhist pilgrims, there's very little information about this group. It remains unclear how many there were and how important the reporting was because they left no written records of their work. But given the very poor quality of British information about the lands beyond India's northern borders, their work is very unlikely to have been on a serious scale. But if we flip this, and instead of thinking about this from a British lens, we can see Gurdjieff hitting all of the points of one of these hillmen, who's the perfect kind of person to infiltrate all of these orgs. He is a wandering Buddhist, Muslim, Christian mystic, and a pagan. He kind of goes through all four of these different things, and he's able to infiltrate. He's the perfect kind of person. He is this third category. Okay. So this is just talking more about this. They said they had many features in common. Most of them started their careers as explorers and intelligence gatherers at a very early age. All were highly proficient linguists, often capable of passing for Asian. They also were bound together by a lack of regard for danger. which in several cases crossed the bounds of irresponsibility. The phrase "the great game" aptly evokes the attitude of these men and their dashing, almost playful attitude to exploration. This is Gurdjieff in a nutshell. He literally gets shot 3 times. He tells us that a huge part of his religious belief is that he has to be in the conflict because the conflict will imperil him and force him to evolve. He's constantly seeking out this nonsense, right? So we're seeing he's kind of the perfect example of one of these people who would be a spy. So let's continue here. More important than the great game was what was going on inside India. The British were aware that there was some Russian intelligence activity in India, but they were surprisingly unconcerned about it. On the eve of the Second Afghan War in 1878, Lytton wrote casually, "There is undoubtedly at this moment in India a certain number of emissaries, foreigners, ostensibly Persians and Afghans, supposed to be acting in the interests of the Russian government and whose movements have been more or less traced in northern India." So by 1878, the Russians are actively sending their own disguised mystics, their own Afghan mystics that are blending into the Indian population and that are doing all this clandestine spying. So in order to dive deep into this, okay, we got to go to...
With one thing real quick, if I can mention.
Absolutely.
This great game, the reason it's a game, it's between cousins.
Yeah.
It's between cousins. So it's not a war, let's say. It's a war, but it's a game. Because either house wins. It's the family wins. That's why it's a game. It's a chess game amongst which cousin gets to rule the world.
So ridiculous and wild. So the next few quotes that I'm going to show you and we're going to talk about, it comes from this book by J.G. Bennett, Gurdjieff Making a New World. And J.G. Bennett was an actual student of Gurdjieff, but he was also a British officer in India. So he has got a really interesting perspective on all this spy stuff and Gurdjieff. And he made a real good, even though he was a believer, he made a very strong, honest attempt to try and see the truth behind Gurdjieff, to be academic and honest, and to try to pierce beyond the myth. So let's dig into what J.G. Bennett has to say about all this spying. Okay. So most of the stories about Gurdjieff's early life, we have almost no records. He has 2 different passports citing 2 different times for his birth, you know, and this probably, again, because he was a spy. So his early life, the only consistent source we have are the books he wrote, Remarkable Men and the 3rd series. So here's what Bennett has to say. Remarkable Men is, as the title implies, an account of the people Gurdjieff met and worked with. It is not concerned with his private researches. In the Herald of Coming Good, Gurdjieff wished to convey the enormous burden he had carried and the importance of his personal contribution in order, as he put it, to shear those who could produce money for his undertakings. In 3rd series, Gurdjieff was more than anywhere else autobiographical, and therefore disclosed facts about his private life that do not appear elsewhere. Even so, there is much that he does not tell us. We can deduce much from Beelzebub's tales, which in many places are obviously and admittedly autobiographical. Beelzebub as professional hypnotist was certainly Gurdjieff himself. A photograph of him taken at the time shows him dressed as a professional magician. He set himself up as a wonder worker in Tashkent, and no doubt did cure drug addicts and drunkards, as I myself saw him do in Turkey in 1921. He probably had some connection with the Russian Secret Service, which was almost necessary in order to travel freely in that politically troubled time. He is most reticent as to his political activities, and this is scarcely surprising. The only reference to a political mission is the account of his journey with Pagosian on the behalf of the Armenian Nationalist Society, the Dashna Kuzitian. So this was him traveling around to explore local sites and to try and to perform like amateur archaeology. But again, it was all in the name of nationalism. Armenia is trying to form their own nation and break apart from the Ottoman Empire at this time.
Now, mind you, one thing too is in a lot of episodes we've gotten to what's called Greco-Bactrian,
Yeah,
the Scythian, the Parthenian. There's other areas. There's this whole area between, let's say, Georgia, Armenia, Scythian land, going all the way to Bangladesh or Bengal. This is the Aryans. This is the horse, the steppes. These cultures are occulted. And they're reutilized by all the different countries into their myths. It's fertile ground.
It's fertile ground for myth making. It's a place where cultures come together. It's the crossroads. It's the literal crossroads, right? Afghanistan is the crossroads. Central Asia is the crossroads. It's where East and West meet. So here, let's see what else he has to say. It says, it is pretty certain that the faculties he enjoyed for traveling in Central Asia on his way to Afghanistan, Chitral, Kashgaria, and Tibet were obtained in the capacity of agent for the Russian government. His almost uniformly hostile references to England, and especially his attack on the young husband expedition into Tibet in 1903.
Do you know about this young husband Tibet this day? Supposedly the Dalai Lama was involved in it, the 13th Dalai Lama, and setting up the British forces to get stuck because of the weather patterns, just how the old Russian thing with the Russian winter, Napoleon and Germany invading. The Youngsplug expedition was impeded and politically they had to concede. Because remember that Britain's invading Tibet at this point. So Gurdjieff or Dorjieff tells the 13th Dalai Lama, hey, have them wait by is it Lhasa, I think?
Lhasa is the capital.
So they get stuck if winter comes. So then, like, there's trickerations going on. There's a lot going on with this stuff. Oh, your mic is off.
Okay, am I back? Can you hear me?
There, you're back.
Okay, that was weird. Okay, this mic can be sensitive sometimes. Okay, so where were we? All right. The young husband expedition into Tibet in 1903 suggests that he was in conflict with the authorities of British India. I can personally confirm that he had an unfavorable dossier in New Delhi because as an intelligence officer in Constantinople in 1920, I first heard of Gurdjieff in a dispatch from New Delhi warning us of a very dangerous Russian agent, George Gurdjieff, who was in Georgia and had applied for a permit to come to Constantinople. By accident, very soon after I received this message, I was invited to dinner by my friend Prince Shabaheddin to meet an old friend of his whom he regarded as a most exceptional man in the field of occultism and spirituality. This was Gurdjieff, and as I have described in Witness, I was very soon convinced that he was far more important as a source of real knowledge than as a former agent of the Tsarist regime. Anyone who knew the Caucasus at that time would suspect that a man who could get permits and move freely through the Bolshevik and social democratic areas must have a secret pull with the authorities. This conclusion was confirmed to me many years later by Sir Paul Dukes, whose knowledge of the Russian situation between 1917 and 1920 was far more intimate than mine. So it's very clear that he was deeply connected and he had all of the, you couldn't just travel to Tibet. You couldn't just travel to India. You couldn't just travel across Central Asia. All of these places were in revolt. There was
you had to be able to be a peasant. You had to be able to put on the disguise of a peasant. You had to be an intellectual. There was a lot of stuff going on with these certain archetypal characters. These spies that are not just a spy in an urban setting, but they're a spy in another country and know how to take on characteristics. And the way they infiltrate or ingratiate themselves into these other countries is through the occult.
And we often forget, like these nations still need to infiltrate tribal groups. They still need to infiltrate religious groups. And when you're dealing with Central Asia at this time in the early 19th century, that's how you get in. You pretend to be a spiritual Sufi, and you look like them and you speak their language. Gurdjieff could do all of this. How many people do you know could do all of that? And we're
There was
also
another one.
deeply educated in English and Russian.
There was another one, Arminius Vambury, who was the prototype for Van Helsing.
Wow.
And he was a spy as well. The Van Helsing of the Bram Stoker myth, or the Dracula stuff. There was a guy named Arminius Vambury who could speak these different Turkic languages, and it's through Sufism. It's through this Sufism is your way to travel into these Central Asian countries, because that's what connects. That's what connects. It's the Silk Road. There's travelers and there's pilgrimages, and Sufis is where people come together in different colors and languages. They come through a nonverbal expressions of Islam, and so that's how these guys could do it.
Yeah, it's so wild. It's beautiful stuff. So let's keep going here. It's going to get even more interesting. So it says, it seems probable then that Gurdjieff was able to use the resources of the Russian Empire to further his own plans, and was even able to penetrate into Tibet from the direction of the Karakoram, at a time when it would have been impossible for an Englishman to enter from India. It is more than probable that he was also able to travel as a healer and wonder worker, and so reach people in Central Asia who would have avoided Russians both as infidels and as a threat to the independence of the Khanates of Turkestan. There is an enormous difference in Asia between being tolerated and being accepted. Acceptance itself has many gradations. Most Asiatics are genuinely spiritual people, and if they recognize in a person a sincere spiritual search, they disregard differences of race or creed and open doors that are not even perceived by the ordinary traveler. This I know from my own experience in Asiatic countries, and Gurdjieff was far more qualified to invoke confidence and gain full acceptance. He was able to accomplish in 10 years what most travels would never begin to recognize as a possibility. This is only a small part of the story. I'm sure that Gurdjieff was recognized as a man with a mission and was given special help that would not have been given to anyone else. Dude was recognized as a peer. They understood that this man was a mystic, and they all let him into their communities, because these societies, like you said, that are along the Silk Road, they really prioritize spiritual seekers.
You know who comes up to my mind immediately? Shams of Tabrizi and Rumi.
Yeah.
It's that archetype of the wandering mystic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's continue here. So by 1924, he ascribes various dances and rituals to monasteries in Sari in Tibet, Makhzari Sharif in Afghanistan, Kizilgan in the Karian Oasis in Chinese Turkestan, and Yangi Hisar in Kashgar. This indicates a very extensive stay in these regions. So he learns, and this has been later on proven by a lot of Gurdjieff's followers. They go to all these places, and this is where the Tibetan Buddhist stuff comes in. So most of his magic remains very rooted in Greek philosophical understanding, in paganism, and in Sufism, except for a lot of the dances and stuff and the mudras. Those have a very deep Buddhist Asiatic kind of tinge. So this brings us to Gurdjieff's statements in the third series, book 4. So this is where he gets autobiographical. He says, under such conditions of tension, years passed then. For this unfortunate physical body of mine came under year of destiny. In 1902, when I was punctured by a second stray bullet, this occurred in the majestic mountains of Tibet, 1 year before the Anglo-Tibetan War. On this second occasion, my unfortunate physical body was able to elude destiny because near me there were 5 good physicians, 3 of European education and 2 specialists of Tibetan medicine, all 5 sincerely devoted to me. After 3 or 4 months of unconscious life for me, had flown still other years of constant physical tenseness and unusual psychic contrivances. He writes much further on that his convalescence occurred in Xinjiang, at a place located in the southern western edge of the Gobi Desert. He adds that it was near to the city of Yanghisar. It seems probable that Gurdjieff was in fact a Russian political agent, but not the famous Lama Gurdjieff. So this is where, we get into different, we also got to understand, right? J.D. Bennett is a guru in the Gurdjieff tradition, right? He is invested in the myth and in the man, right? Even though I do believe he's trying to be academic, he's also never going to play into or give light to a lot of conspiracy. So just bear that in mind. He had access to Tibetan Lama series and learned the techniques of energy control and other psychic rather than spiritual powers in the Tibetan Lamas are perhaps the world's greatest specialists. This interpretation is strengthened by Gurdjieff's association of this period with his full elucidation of the secrets of the astral body. I think it is relevant that in Beelzebub's Tales, Gurdjieff uses the term Kezjan, body, to designate what is usually called the astral body. Kezjan is a combination of two Persian words that would be used in Afghanistan. So it seems like Gurdjieff got a lot of his out-of-body magic that is so central to his work from the Greco-Bactrian tradition, the Buddhist, Muslim, in pagan syncretism of that Central Asian steep. That's where a lot of this stuff is coming from. Wild stuff, eh?
Well, I guess in the great game, spycraft, that's where you got to go. I mean, that's where they all end up, because that's what they're fighting over.
That's what they're fighting over. And it's like, in Gurdjieff's mind, he was like, of course, the greatest magical understandings are going to be in the places where there's the most violence and war. It's like, this just makes perfect sense.
Shambhala, Shangri-La.
Right? So here, let's continue. It says, the events in Transcaucasia in the passage cited above certainly refer to the abortive Russian Revolution of 1905. So now we're jumping ahead to another part. So Gurdjieff gets shot 3 times in his life in various wars. The third time he gets shot is in the Russian Revolution. The Russian-Japanese War, with its humiliating reverses, had turned the Russian people against the government of the Tsar. The famous night attack of February 5th, 1904, in which half the Russian fleet had been destroyed in Port Arthur, failed to arouse a patriotic response. The Home Minister, Pelvy, was blown up with his carriage in July. This and many other acts of violence were attributed to the Union for Liberation founded by Lenin in London. It is likely that, conforming to his plan of penetrating into the holies of holies of every movement, Gurdjieff joined the caucus branch of the Union. Gurdjieff was a communist.
Where did Lenin found it at?
In London.
Yeah, I'm just saying. What is this a game? I'm just saying. Keep going, please.
It's so freaking wild, right? Before revolution broke out in 1905, Gurdjieff had been wounded and returned to Central Asia. Nevertheless, his contact with the revolutionary movement was probably more than transient. In later life, he used to speak of the injustice of the Tsarist regime in a way that shocked Uspensky and others who had belonged to the aristocratic party. A lot of his followers in later life were Russian elites. And Gurdjieff, by that point, was a full-on fucking revolutionary. And he offended their sensibilities. He offended their sensibility. He also, he comes from a minority and had no country at this point. So he has reason to be upset with the Tsarists and the communists both.
Whereas PD, Uspensky, had a different nationalistic.
Yeah.
So he had a different bet, but he knew how to play the keep things balanced, so he doesn't go down in history as a traitor of anything.
Well, what we see with Bennett and with Uspensky is they take Gurdjieff's stuff and they make it palatable and marketable. to at least to a certain degree. I mean, in modern times, the Gurdjieff work has become, there's people all over the world doing it, but it's, you know, it's very much, it's a smaller thing. But there was a point when Gurdjieff radicalized, he transformed the whole spiritual world. This whole idea of the guru got flipped on its head, and how you go about doing that. You know, he was the guru who came to you and laughed in your face, who mocked you, who made you dance until you passed out, you know, who would intimidate people and make them feel small. He was kind of like Diogenes reborn. He even described himself as such, you know? There's a lot of wild man intensity with the man, and he freaked everyone out. So it says, after Gurdjieff had recovered from the bullet wounds he had collected in Tibet, he returned to the Caucasus to be with his family. He no doubt got involved. Oh, wait, we did read that. Sorry. Okay. So now we're going to jump to Gurdjieff's own words. So we looked at J.G. Bennett there. Oh, wait, there was one part I wanted to see here. This part, sorry. That's why I put this here. Okay. Later to become world famous as, so he did. He says, no doubt got involved in the revolutionary movement, and it is possible that Jugandashvili, which is a character in his writings, was the Georgian revolutionary later to become world famous as Joseph Stalin. Was in the same group. They were in the same group. It has recently been alleged that Stalin was a Tsarist agent, which give rise to many interesting speculations. They were both former Tsarist agents who flipped and became revolutionaries. And they're both involved in the same group here. I certainly... Go ahead.
And I was going to say, these czars are informed by Papus, Rasputin, Arthur D., Lamas from Tibet. There's the czarists are see, that's what the people don't really understand, the czarist occult mysticism.
Yeah.
Which packages up the East and the West, like you say.
Yeah. It gets so wild. Like, listen to this. I certainly myself heard Gurdjieff say that he had known Stalin and had been at the seminary with him. So Gurdjieff even says that this is all true. Whether this was fact or fantasy, Gurdjieff most positively asserts that he was wounded by a stray bullet at the end of 1904 in the region neighborhood of the Chiator Tunnel. It may be well that he was both a revolutionary and an agent of the government. When I was in that line of business myself, I knew several who cheerfully played a double role without, as Gurdjieff would have put it, experiencing any remorse of conscience. Now, if anyone could have been a double agent who didn't care, it would have been Gurdjieff. And if anyone would have walked the middle path between all of this nonsense, it would have been Gurdjieff. You know? Like it's such wild craziness. So now we're going to look at a couple passages from the third part of his series, All in Everything, which is known as the third series, or Life is Real Only Then When I Am. So this is going to talk about the different bullets he got shot with and the different kind of crazy revolutions he was a part of. Hi, kitty. Make sure you pet the kitty, Dion. The first of these three incomprehensible fatal events happened in 1896 on the island of Crete, 1 year before the Greco-Turkish War. From there, while still unconscious, I was brought, I don't know why, by some unknown Greeks to Jerusalem. Soon with consciousness returned, although with my health not yet quite restored, I in the company of others, just as myself, seekers of pearls and manure, set out for Jerusalem, for Russia, not by water as normal people ordinarily do, but by land on foot. So he talks about how he went across as a seeker after he got shot. You know, we talked about the second bullet. We'll jump to the third one here. It says, seeking about this third stray bullet, I cannot here deny myself the opportunity for the pleasure of some, for the displeasure of others of my acquaintances of the present time. I'm now saying openly about the third bullet that it was plucked into me, of course unconsciously, by some charmer from among those two groups of people who, fallen on one side under the influence of revolutionary psychosis, and on the other under the sway of imperious superiors, accidental upstarts, together laid then, also of course unconsciously, the basic foundation stones of the great groundwork of the, at least today, indeed, great Russia. So he's talking about how he was stuck, he got shot because he's stuck in the middle of these two myths doing battle with each other. He was well aware of what the fuck was going on.
Wow.
So this is a really interesting character. So this brings in another side to it, which was first introduced with that blog. Was Gurdjieff spied on? Was Gurdjieff spied on? So this is Ethel Mertzon, and Ethel Mertzon is a famous kind of a magical person in her own right. She was deeply connected to a bunch of different magical people, from Gurdjieff to Krishnamurti to Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. And she lived for like 35 years in India. Was also connected to Elaine Danilou and his partner. Oh. So there's some real interesting overlap here. So one of the wild things, though, is Elaine Danilou accuses her of being a spy and accuses her of spying on him and on Gurdjieff. Okay? So this comes to us from Elaine Danilou's autobiography, The Way to the Labyrinth. So he's talking about, she uses a fake name here. Her real name is Ethel Mertzon. She goes by Juliet. So it says, an English spinster who lived in an annex of the Theosophical Society at the other end of town, became interested in my musical studies and research. Her name was Juliet Mertzon. Each year, as a joke, Raymond would remove a letter from her name. First she was Juliet, then Liet, then Iet. I put her seriously to work, typewriting, editing texts, and making endless calculations of musical intervals. She was extraordinarily devoted, and we were quite fond of her. It was obvious, however, that she had to make weekly reports on everything that was said or done at Rewa Kothi. So that is the ashram that him and his lover are staying in. Because she was genuinely attached to Raymond and me and seriously interested in my work, her reports were probably very useful to us and counteracted many of the efforts of some locals who detested these Europeans turned native and denounced us several times for subversive activities. The day of Juliet's 60th birthday, we organized a very beautiful party in her honor. The house was decorated with oil lamps, flowers, and garlands. We had prepared a feast and wrapped presents. It was obvious that no one had celebrated this lonely old spinster's birthday since her childhood. Juliet broke down and burst into tears. But you don't know who I am or what I do. Of course we know, but it doesn't really matter because we love you. Juliet left Varanasi shortly after the end of the war. She retired to an ashram in southern India for reasons probably connected with her work. She continued to write me from time to time. In her last letter, she wrote, I am suffering from a hemorrhage and no one can stop it. In a few days, I shall be dead. I just want to tell you how much I loved you both and thank you for all the happiness you have given me. After that, I received nothing more. Juliet had lost the last letter of her name. Before she came to work for us, she was a disciple of Gurdjieff and spied on him as well. She often spoke of her years with him. So Elaine Danilou and his partner Raymond, they allowed her to spy because they saw it in their best interest, because they're like, look, we're not involved in any political anything. We're just here writing about music and mysticism. So if she spies on us and reports to the authorities that we're not a problem, this is great. So they allowed her to stay around as a spy for that reason, but they recognized it. And she even admitted it to them. So what I then went going into is that this woman, right? She's a famous spiritualist in her own right. And she knew all these incredible, famous gurus. You know, with her work as a spy, she wound up working with all of these famous Indians.
Now check this out. Before you change that picture, at the bottom right-hand corner, is that Krishnamurti?
That's Krishnamurti.
Who was part of politics and mechanizations dealing with the Theosophical Society and Blavatsky and different people and dealing with Indian politics, British, Indo-Russian politics at that. There's a lot more to the gurus, Yogananda and all my favorite gurus. I'm just saying.
Oh, yeah, man. And Krishnamurti wasn't even, he wasn't even explicitly religious, right? He was more philosophical. He was more connected to that and open about the games that they were playing. Wild stuff.
And I don't think he wanted to be the new
No, he did not. No, he did not. That is that horrible Ledbetter and the
C.W.
found,
Ledbetter.
right? So
Well,
we got to talk about this a bit. So after Blavatsky passes away, right? Ledbetter and Besant take over, and to the point it becomes almost new organization. You got to talk about neo theosophy and original theosophy under Blavatsky, right? The stuff under Besant and Ledbetter is all deeply tainted because Ledbetter was a serial abuser of children. And while they were doing all this stuff, like they went to India to find the new Mahatma, the new Christ on earth, the new great world leader. And they believed through magical reasons that it was Krishnamurti. And they took him and his twin brother off the streets and they brought him into home and stuff. But they were crazy religious psychopaths. And Ledbetter abused Krishnamurti and many others. And they all messed up Krishnamurti's head trying to tell him he was God. Like it's such a deeply frigged up scenario that Ledbetter
to,
and Besant brought about.
to place them into Indian politics.
Oh yeah, so much wildness plays into all of this kind of politics and spirituality and whatnot. Like the Theosophical Society was deeply powerful in challenging British hegemony through Eastern mythology and Eastern mythological revitalization. I always tell people, right? Gandhi didn't read the freaking Mahabharata in Hindi. He didn't read it in Sanskrit. He read it in English as translated by the Theosophical Society. This is just the reality, And it's like their influence is so deep, it's so huge, even on things that you wouldn't consider are about the Theosophical Society.
Yeah, like World War I and World War II.
Right? Oh man, so much wildness. So let's check out. So I wanted to look at the biography of Ethel Murchison to see, right? What does she have to say about the spying? And of course, the spying is absent, but the biographer does bring up this instance. So it goes. Ethel says nothing of this and very little about the war, the great game, the British, Russian, Indian War, other than the official corruption it brought to the village. Bandits and dyecoats are unofficial criminals, but with the progress of the war came increasing opportunities for official corruption and its concomitants. I had nothing to do with the war itself or with the independence movement, except insofar as they brought many more problems to the village. Regularly, the subversive news sheet would be brought to me before passed on to the village. I had no compunction in not denouncing it, considering the way money was being extorted from the villagers and their recruiting done. I had sympathy with the underdog, though not to the extent by what I would do all I could to thwart any schemes of anti-government violence widespread in India at the time. Spy or not, Elaine thought Ethel was useful to them because she was genuinely attached to Raymond and me and seriously interested in my work, and her reports were probably very useful to us and counteracted many of the efforts, as we saw, right? So that's what she had to say about it. There's another point in the book, though, that was pretty interesting, where she talks about meeting Gurdjieff and working with Gurdjieff. So she was one of the first students who joined Gurdjieff when he moved to France and he set up his teaching school at France. And so this is the moment she met Gurdjieff. And this is quite interesting, it says. Learning that Gurdjieff was then in Berlin, Ethel spent a week there, but made no mention of it in her diary. By late summer, her back trouble flaring, she decided to seek out Gurdjieff, now in Paris, and ask him to take me on. For a good half hour, Gurdjieff sat on the bench in silence. He was, Ethel felt, weighing up whether to take me or not. She waited, saying nothing, the intensity of the atmosphere between them increasing. Finally, Gurdjieff rose from the bench and said simply, "Come." He took her to his flat for lunch. Afterwards, he told her to go at once to his institute, which he was establishing at the Chateau de Preux, a large chateau near the village of Avon, about 45 miles south of Paris. Preux lay at an ancient crossroad where centuries pilgrims have passed, as they do to this day. So it was a magical place that he chose at the center of a Christian crossroad. And he eyed her up in silence for a half an hour before he agreed to take her. Now, most people believe that Gurdjieff knew that she was a spy. Gurdjieff was a real intense person, and he was beyond charming. And he used to pride himself on breaking people down, on manipulating them and exposing their limitations. So the odds that this woman could stand against him and not be exposed are very slim. If Elaine Danilou could do the same, and Elaine Danilou, he's a French musical scholar, who's hanging out with his lover in India. They're not spies at all, right? And they caught her. So I think Gurdjieff knew. And it becomes more relevant because Gurdjieff didn't allow her to do a lot of major things. And eventually she got frustrated and winds up moving on. So here's a moment where he denies her. It says, Ethel was shocked and disappointed at not being among those chosen. In time, it seemed she came to rationalize the rejection, thinking that Gurdjieff was right as usual, both for me and for the Payeur. For we were a small community left to carry on, and I perhaps the most responsible. But the hurt must have remained, for upon Gurdjieff's return in June, she told him, I'm ready to go if you wish. A long silence. Finally, if I useful to you, stay. If I not useful, go. Ethel decided to stay. Several months later, the blow descended. So basically what he told her, it's like, if you want to stick around, but I'm not doing anything for you. If you're going to be here, you're going to work for me. And that's it. Because he kind of recognized her as what she was. On July 6, 1924, driving from Paris to the chateau, Gurdjieff suddenly swerved to avoid a car. So this is where he winds up achieving. So she does become instrumental. She helps him record Beelzebub's tales to his grandson, because during this near-death experience, he has a revelation, like he says here. He says, take down, I am being told, I hear. And he says, only when he recovered complete consciousness did he claim the writing as his, the book as his own. To Ethel, the book is in two distinct parts, one inspired and the other watch, very Mr. Gurdjieff, the man with his tongue in his cheek, constantly exposing people. So that's where I wanted to end. So that's the end of my presentation. So we get this really interesting image of Gurdjieff. But it's really hard to understand exactly who and what Gurdjieff was, because he constantly lied. His past is all obscured. There's no information. And most of those lies were all about just exposing people, undercutting them. So most of his followers don't even believe. It's not about the lie, it's about the work, Gurdjieff was always about that work of transformation. Really interesting character. So based on this, what is your thoughts? Do you think Gurdjieff in his early life was working for Tsarist Russia? Do you think he switched to the communist and then took off to France? Or do you think he was just a spiritual seeker running around in Central Asia?
Both.
Just like Crowley, right? Both.
Most of these guys. Both? And why not both? Because it only sets the stage for where we're at in modern times with Ukraine and what's Russia and what's Putin and these different wars and stuff. And this gives you a little backstory into, people always been fighting for this neck of the woods over there and for different regions, trying to etch out a nationalistic identity on the planet Earth.
Yep. It's always about these empowered myths and the securing of land and the drawing yourself into some ancient magical past, right? And you can see this even in the way that people conceptualize and write. Like, I love a lot of German literature, and one of the struggles for the Germanic people in the European scene was that they were seen as young. They were a newer country. They didn't have that ancient old roots, They were new. Goethe was their main writer, and this was all brand new. So there was this whole big thing with the National Socialist movement to have to create this. Well, no, actually, we white people are the originators of all human society. You know, we go back to the primordial past, and
Shambhala.
everything is ripping us off, right? Our roots are actually in the Himalayas. You know, like they flip the pole. They say, fine, then if you're going to say that you're more ancient and more powerful, then we're the most ancient. You know, it's all
Well,
nonsense.
you know, if you guys, anybody out there, all of y'all, like, subscribe, leave a comment, share if you enjoyed any of this nonsense. You know, join us
Exactly.
next week.
And remember that this is all speculation. It's all a lot of fun. One of the interesting things I wanted to leave you with, Dion, before we call it, though, is when I was looking to Gurdjief, there is so much modern QAnon craziness associated with Gurdjief, you know, and none of it has been able to be sourced or anything. But it's all this stuff. They're saying that he was a secret agent of British colonial powers there to undermine the czars and then the communists, and that he basically empowered Stalin and created Stalin to destroy communist Russia. It's like it gets freaking wild. And that he used to train based on the, remember I told you those comments he made about police and prostitutes? Based upon this, he was training an army of like women assassins, you know, to infiltrate and to pursue British capital. A lot of wild craziness.
Manchurian Candidate. You know, let's just say that'll lead us into the next episode when we get into, well, that's how we give birth to Alexander Dugin, and we get QAnon and Michael Aquino, and we'll get into some what happens after this, all this nonsense. Well, it keeps going.
It keeps going, right? You need new myths, new stories, and you need new taboos and new ways to play, right? What does Dugin do? He says, you know what? I'm both a Nazi and a Bolshevik. And then people go, that doesn't make any sense. That's ridiculous. Exactly. And that's the point. You know, I'm just extreme and F you. And this is a form of magic. It invokes a certain level of attention and it grabs you. And people like Dugin are very freaking aware of what they're doing.
And they're versed in all this history that we're barely, I'm scratching the surface of, we're barely looking at.
They live that myth.
Yeah, they got all those books. They're like, oh, that's my favorite book. What are you talking about? So next time we're gonna go deeper. We're gonna show you how there's continuity of this train of thought.
Yeah, it's all magic. It's all myth making, and it's all about taking the land. All right, everyone. Thank you guys for joining us. Like and subscribe. Dion, any final words?
Stay blessed.
All right, stay blessed indeed. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you again next week for part 4 of our deep dive into the occulted world of espionage and the great game.
Big game.
Take care. Thanks, guys. Bye.